suggest to the scientific community that we are devolving rather than evolving.
Well, you're referring to the Burgess Shale and what's his name's book, Wonderful Life, right? Yeah. I sort of differ with your interpretation of it. It wasn't that these things were more complex than any life forms on the earth today. It was that they represented a large number of phyla, none of which exist on the earth today. So the point that was being made by the paleontologists is apparently we started out with many different phyla, and then it narrowed at some point into just a few phyla, which then re-radiated out into all the forms we possess today. So I think other people have brought this up, and it's a troubling example because it tends to throw a railroad tie against the onrushing of my rhetorical freight train, but that's the name of the game, folks. It probably is true that at an early point in the evolution of life, I mean, it's obviously now established, there were these many, many different phyla, and for unknown reasons, certain phyla became extinct, and then the phyla which were left radiated and filled all the abandoned niches that had previously been occupied by these now extinct organisms. But nevertheless, we have to look at this question of, for reasons unknown, they became extinct. Why did some phyla survive and others not? It would be inconsistent with the theory of evolution to suggest that this happened entirely by chance. There must have been some adaptive advantage possessed by the phyla that made it through whatever these narrow evolutionary necks were, and then the phyla which survived these climatological crises, or whatever they are, radiated into an incredible number of complex forms that nevertheless could be traced to a small number of earlier phyla. A more, in line with the thrust of your argument, a more difficult to answer objection that I don't know why I'm telling you this because it erodes my own position, but I was preaching this, the world complexifies through time rap at Esalen one time, and a guy was staying with me there who was a professional Russian translator. He was a Russian and a linguist. And he said, you know, there's a major exception to your rule that all phenomena complexify through time, and that is language. He said as we go back into the past, languages become richer. And I am still puzzling over this. I don't think it's an inherent property of language. I think it's because as we go back into the past, languages become more and more localized, and local variations develop in small, confined geographical areas, so that then when you pour all these languages together, there tends to be a certain leveling, and this probably results in a general fall in the total number of words being used in a language. In other words, if in Canada they call a windshield a windscreen, and in England they call it something else, well then as long as Canada, England, and the U.S. don't communicate, we have 3 words for windshield. But if these 3 cultures communicate frequently and deeply, probably a couple of these words will become obsolete or colloquial, and one term will dominate. So language is not evolving in a vacuum. You have to look at the effects of modern transportation, migrations of people, and that sort of thing. I agree that this complexification through time thing has the characteristic of a general tendency, but it's not an ironclad natural law. we can see that now, for instance, communism in the Soviet Union acted as a deep freeze for traditional cultures. Wonderful traditional cultures exist out on the steppes of Central Asia, in Kyrgyzia, Turkmenistan, Nagorno-Badakhshanskaya, and these places. Well, these wonderful traditional cultures are probably now all trading in their colorful garb, vocabularies, and technologies for transistor radios, subscriptions to Time magazine and Der Spiegel, and generally lining up with the global leveling of culture that we see in the 20th century. So these are complex issues, and you're right, it isn't entirely straightforward. Do you mean the one to Prague or the one to Italy?
Whatever you like to
Well, I went to Prague to the ITA conference, International Transpersonal Association conference in June, and I had never realized till I went there. It was my second trip to Czechoslovakia. But, you know, as children, we grew up with a wonderful story of an emerald green country farmed by happy munchkins and ruled from a beautiful capital city built around a splendiferous palace presided over by a wizard. And I realized Czechoslovakia is Oz for grown-ups. And the morphogenetic field of the place is such that it might be a place we should all consider as a good venue for an archaic revival. I think Prague in the 90s could be what Paris in the 20s was. It is, after all, the capital of old Bohemia. You may not know why we are called Bohemians. You don't have to have a Slavic gene in your entire family tree and can claim yourself as a Bohemian. It's because Bohemia stood for individual freedom, eccentricity, the magical arts, the practice of the arts, and a science which more gently approached the union of spirit and matter. And this whole potential alchemical civilization based around Prague was destroyed by the 30 Years' War. If you're interested in all this, you should read Frances Yates' book, The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, in which she shows that at a certain point in Western history, there was the possibility of a Protestant alchemical revival in Central Europe that was bungled by a series of diplomatic and cultural misunderstandings and led instead to the 30 Years' War, which then, before the 30 Years' War, Europe was thoroughly medieval in its character, really, and at the end of the 30 Years' War, modernity was launched. I mean, the absolute power of kings had been replaced by parliaments and peoples, and Prague, when the people who won the 30 Years' War got down to redrawing the maps of Europe, they made sure that Prague fell on the wrong side of the language line and became a place that spoke a language spoken nowhere else in Europe, Czech, instead of the language that had been spoken there before the 30 Years' War by the court, which was Italian. So it's a whole lost episode in Western history that not too many people know about, but we could all return to our Bohemian roots and create a community under the gentle aegis of Václav Havel and similar philosophically right-thinking people that might be a window of opportunity. It's very important when you're trying to make social change that you find the proper resting place for your fulcrum, or a proper fulcrum for your lever. And the best place is outside the system that you're trying to move. And if we're serious about carrying on a major critique of American society, Prague might be an excellent place from which to do it. especially if by some nightmarish fluke of fate the knotheads currently in power are able to hang on. Sorry for that brief foray into politics. That's what Richard was trying to bait me into, yeah.
According to Western mythology, people are aware of Atlantis, the land of the New Lemuria, which some say existed because of California, several miles above where we are today. In a place called Decker Canyon, there's a lost civilization with walls that surround the city and artifacts carved into the mountains that could not have possibly been from the Indians. The technology that they believe was a part of this lost civilization was from another world. Could you comment on what your feelings are in terms of our planet being colonized by extraterrestrials in terms of Atlantis and Lemuria, or the land of Mu?
Yeah, I can. I'm not sure how much comfort it will give you. It seems to me an underwhelming proposition. In other words, if this happened, where is the evidence? There have been fabulous civilizations existing in the past, but their artifacts, their buildings, their earthworks are available to be visited and seen. It seems to me, in trying to build models, I try to follow Occam's razor. You all know what Occam's razor is? Hypotheses should not be multiplied without necessity. And I just find the lost continent thing an unnecessary hypothesis. I think there are lost civilizations, but I think we do a grave injustice to our dilemma and our accomplishments by thinking that anybody ever stood in this position before. To me, you see, there's an impulse that's very old in the Western mind to, and strangely enough, I trade on it to some degree. It's called the nostalgia for paradise. And it's that we're always looking back to a lost golden age. And I think there was a lost golden age on the plains of Africa 15 to 20,000 years ago. I discussed it this morning. But I don't think high technology has ever existed before on this planet. Well, there's just no evidence of it. And the Atlantean people and the enthusiasts of Mu and Lemuria are always trying to fiddle with the dates and say, the Great Pyramid is 25,000 years old, and there's a ruin on the Nazca Plain that's 50,000 years old. This is, first of all, the evidence is absolutely unconvincing, and second of all, the miracle is not how old the breakout into language and technology is, but how recent it is.
I agree with you. I think that if you were to go scuba diving off of Bermuda and the Bimini Islands, you would find what many people believe are artifacts from Atlantis. You can hike in Decker Canyon, and most of what is to be found is underwater because of the shift in the continental plates 10,000 years ago or more. But many people believe that the UFO involvement in that civilization is still very active today. I know someone who I believe you met last night, Robert Stanley from Unicus Magazine, who takes people on these expeditions in Decker Canyon. He took somebody at the beginning of the summer, and a roll of film was shot. The person was from the East Coast, I believe in Boston, and he spaced on the development of the film. He just forgot about it, and he decided, okay, I might as well get this developed. And sure enough, hovering in the distance over this part of the canyon were 12 saucers. And it's a pretty obvious picture. I saw it last night for the first time. And I'm just curious because I think that a lot of us don't really deal with a lot of the information that's coming out right now because it's overwhelming. It's almost like, wow.
Well, I am prepared to be convinced, but I'm not willing to buy in without a fair amount of evidence. as far as UFOs are concerned, I've thought a lot about it. I've seen them far away, up close, and it's not what people say it is. And the problem, there are two phenomena. The UFO, who knows what that is, and then the UFO community. And my God, these people are much weirder than UFOs. I mean, the whole slew of them. And the whole problem with the UFO community is apparently these people have never heard about the rules of evidence. I mean, they're just full of revelation after revelation with absolutely zip to back it up. There are so many, I mean, you look at these UFO magazines. Well, do you want to believe Master Chen Thuk of the Nabungi system, or do you want to go with the Billy Myers crowd, or what's coming out of Brazil? I think Jacques Vallée in one of his books estimated that if you don't believe UFOs only appear where there are witnesses, and take the number of sightings seen by people and extrapolate that by the area of the surface of the Earth, you have to conclude that UFOs are coming and going from this planet at a rate of 12,000 a month. Well, my God, what kind of extraterrestrial contact is this? That 12,000 a month for 50 years and never a definitive piece of evidence. I was talking to one of the researchers on the fetal abduction thing. This guy was all excited. He said to me, you know, I've talked to 500 women who claim surgical removal of fetuses. And he said, yeah, and you know, the amazing thing, there's not a single sign of physical invasion of these women's bodies. And I said, well, Dr. X, doesn't this suggest something to you? And he said, yeah, advanced surgical techniques of which we have no knowledge. I said, well, yeah, but doesn't it, I mean, give me a break. So I think they have to operate in the light of the same evidence as everybody else. And their problem is that they claim to know too much. They're just willing to tell you, you know, 125,000 years ago they arrived to grow sweet peas, and then 100,000 years ago the project changed and the 11th planet did something. Too much data. It's too Jack Armstrong-ish.
Do you believe our government has the technology to travel in ships to other stars? Do you think we're doing that today, or do you think that's our future?
No, I don't think we're doing that today. I mean, we have a government that can't knock off a loudmouth in Baghdad, let alone travel to other stars.
So you believe our space program,
Pardon me?
Space program is limited to what NASA tells us is the reality of what's going on, and that's basically it? You don't think there's like an underground or a whole network of societies and organizations within our government that are involved in research and technology?
Well, obviously there is a black portion of the government where research goes on and probably fairly kinky things are carried out. But these people are no different from us. I mean, some of them may be here today. And I don't mean cops, I mean, you know, there may be NASA scientists here today that we are not so different from the people we're talking about. Human beings cannot keep a secret. You may bank on it. And so the idea that, you know, somebody possesses a technology thousands of years in advance of us, I mean, then when you actually tear the lid off some of these government black operations, you don't find super scientists and brilliant minds. You find people like Gordon Liddy and John Dean and, you know, half-wits, clowns seem to lie behind most of this. I believe that I am not a conspiracy person. I believe that nobody is in control, and that the people who seek control are the most misguided of all, and that there's a great deal more than we don't know than we do know. And, you know, I would love to be convinced that something really far out were happening, but it just always seems to come apart in your hands. These are, I consider stuff like the UFO phenomenon as popularly commercially available UFO beliefs as basically viruses of language, diseases of understanding. If you could teach people about the laws of evidence and how you build a case and stuff like that, then people wouldn't be troubled by this. The same fuzzy thinking that permits people to believe in UFOs permits them to believe in the imminent expectation of the second coming, or, the face of Christ appearing on tortillas, and all of this stuff.
Terence, may I stop here for a second? Is there a lot of people still with questions? Because they still have a lot of time, well, at least till 6 o'clock, supposedly. Can I have a show of hands? Okay, there's a few more, because we want to sort of limit the questions to one question per person and sort of one rebuttal from that, so that everybody can get a fair share before we make a final.
Is this a gentle hint to stop raving about UFOs?
He just want to make sure he believes in UFOs. He doesn't want to hear any more about it.
Oh, I see. Well, I say to the UFO people the same thing, what can you show us? Drag it forth. Everything has to be judged on the same field. If you've got something, spill it. But to claim, as I don't want to use names here, but stories like, well, we met the UFOs and they gave us a message from mankind, but when we got back to our car, our tape recorder had miraculously erased itself. Well, then be quiet. Don't tell anybody this. Don't you understand how lame that sounds to the doubter? It's not the believer you have to convince. They're a pushover. What are you going to do about your skeptics? That's the problem. Well, you want me to tell you a story? Yeah. I was in the Amazon. I was in a state of considerable psychic turmoil, and I sat up all night. This is told, by the way, in the book True Hallucinations, which will be published next year. And at dawn, I looked across this lake, and there was a thin line of clouds on the horizon. And I watched this line of clouds, and then suddenly I noticed that they were turning in place, like a pencil spinning on its axis in one place. And then the clouds, this line of clouds broke apart into 4 perfectly identical lenticular clouds. And then the 4 lenticular clouds merged into 2 lenticular clouds. And then the 2 merged into 1. And as they merged into 1, I heard the whee, whee, whee sound of Hollywood science fiction flying saucers, and I realized this thing was coming toward me across the lake. And it was absolutely convincing. It was a flying saucer, the real thing. And I was absolutely convinced that it was going to take me at that moment. And as it passed over, only about 200 feet above my head, I could see it clearly enough that I could see rivets on its underside. I could see its running lights. I could see it. But you know what I saw? I saw the end cap of a 1932 model Hoover vacuum cleaner. It was the very same flying saucer that George Adamski suspended from a piece of mylar fishing line in 1953 and photographed in his garage, one of the most famous UFO hoaxes of all time. I saw it, a diameter of 40 feet, over the Amazon basin, and I knew what I was looking at. It was more disturbing than if it had been a ship from Zeta Reticuli, because it had built-in cognitive dissonance. What?
Mind couldn't sort of perceive the magnitude of it, so it's sort of like you did a mental override. I saw you, though. It was a very short story, wasn't it?
If it's a very short story.
You were in the jungle. up this road which is below, and then sort of like went up to the top of the hill. It's all electromagnetic movement, but sort of looking out. And then it came down the hillside, and it went between two houses at window level. And it went along some highway. And I had two witnesses with me. And a friend of mine who lived there was driving a car underneath the thing the station. We saw it about really for 15 minutes. Then I accelerated in the room between the two mountains. Each time we were together, over here, check it out. They didn't want to have any part of it.
Well, see, I believe you completely. I don't have any problem with that. It's simply an enormous leap to say that that was a craft from another star. It's much better to just say it's a who knows what it is. The world is full of weird stuff. Just briefly, here's my best theory on flying saucers and a whole bunch of other stuff. This tries to solve all problems of this sort simultaneously. The transcendental object at the end of time, let's drag it in here. And let's imagine that it is like those mirrored balls that they hang in discos above the bar and spin. So then I think that definitely there is a forward movement of causal necessity which propels us from the past into the present on into the future. But that there is also, and necessary to account for precognitive visions and stuff like that, which happen all the time, a flow of information from the future into the past. And the transcendental object at the end of time is casting reflections of itself backward into the past. And if you are struck, whatever that means, by one of these scintillas from the transcendental object at the end of time, then you begin to cure and teach. And if you really got a good hit, possibly raise the dead. I mean, I'm not sure how far it can go. Now, also, these images of the transcendental object at the end of time haunt the skies of this planet in the form of spinning vortices of contradiction. This is what Jung said. He said, the UFO is an image of the self. And I don't mean the little self. I mean the collective self of humanity. So a story like Jim's story is I have no problem with it. I take it as true. It's the people who say, and they revealed the nature of the fall of Atlantis and the world plan, then it's too much because it's coming through human interpretation. The horrible thing about the UFO people who claim contact is that the aliens they present to us are so incredibly mundane. So much more mundane than what you would encounter on a DMT flash that they're just like the neighbors next door. I think that, alien intelligence, the trick is not to find it, but to recognize it when it's in front of you. Intelligence is a very slippery concept. Sometimes we can't even identify it in the person sitting next to us on the bus. So how can you expect to identify the intelligence of an alien? It just seems incredibly unlikely to me. I think the world is a lot stranger than we suppose without evoking benevolent aliens who prefer vegetarian diets and who come from the stars. I mean, why do they so fit our preconception of what they would be? I mean, silvery humanoids. Alien intelligence and alien life, when and if you meet it, you'll know you're in the presence of the real thing because you'll be barely able to wrap your mind around it.
Yeah, I'm basically in agreement with you. I was just kind of pondering over the idea of my earlier question about, well, if we perceive these as being aliens, that's one thing. But what happens if, in fact, these humanoid creatures that we're defining are us? traveling back through time and being able to materialize through the future technology, then we're talking about something different. I'm not saying that this is true. This is only part of my own speculation.
Well, it's an attractive idea. It raises problems, as I'm sure you're aware, the grandfather paradox and so forth and so on. But it's a possibility. I think it's more likely that these are emissaries from the land of the dead than from the Pleiades. Right. And that since they speak English, since they look humanoid, since they seem to care about us and our technologies and so forth, they seem remarkably human.
Well, maybe they're concerned about their own state of well-being. Maybe somehow it's related to the what's going on here now and what the outcome is going to be. Maybe that's going to somehow affect the way they are. We've seen it in Star Trek. The ideas of people coming back from the future to there is a paradox obviously involved in this, so it's a lot of our imagination at work. But at the same in the same ideas, maybe there's a certain sense of reality about it. Maybe there is.
It could be a holographic projection out of the Gaian mind. It could be, a race of intelligent saurians that rose and fell before the asteroid impact that wiped out the dinosaurs. It could be all and everything. The trick is to try and get some kind of evidentiary hold on it. Yeah.
Terence, this is a nut and bolt question. But first I'd like to preface it by saying that I haven't used psychedelics in 20 years, and I haven't used marijuana in 7, and have been considering return to the use of psychedelics. And when I stopped, the last experience which I had, it wasn't a terrifying experience and it wasn't a bad trip. It was similar. It presents similar insights that I have heard you mention and speak of. But there were times in which my psychedelic use left me rather shaken and terrified, dealing with fear of death and crossing over the line. Though I have to say that my very first psychedelic experience was one which contained a death and rebirth experience. So I don't know why after that, but that's the nature of fear, I suppose. So the question is, it's a nut and bolt question. It's how does one proceed with the use of psychedelics after a long absence from it, and not make the mistakes and not run into the walls that I occasionally ran into, or deal with them, get around them, so forth and so on.
Well, I think the best protection against unpleasant experiences on psychedelics is to do it with care and attention in environments that are safe and low on sensory input. In other words, you don't take it and go to a crowded singles bar or even a rock and roll concert. I mean, if you have to combine psychedelics with rock and roll, do it with low doses.
No, I took it in the desert, in the mountains.
Well, this is the way to do it. It isn't always going to be ecstatic, but it's almost always guaranteed to be educational. There's no way you can seal yourself off from shock, because shock may be what you need. But you can, attention to it. I mean, fasting, going into it, cleaning yourself up, creating a safe space, not going to it if you've just been highly agitated by some emotional upheaval in your life, and then take a long time to integrate it and think about it. It's basically, in the best sense of the word, a religious activity, and and the intellect or whatever it is that lies behind it is very sensitive to your needs and your limits. And unless you approach it with a cavalier attitude, it will usually be very gentle with you. Now, this fear of death thing, though, is a hard thing to come to terms with because, we are going to die. It's scripted into the human experience. Culturally, there's a great deal of anxiety around this. And basically, I think what one has to do is simply ride it out in terms of advice as to what you do once you are in the middle of an unpleasant revelation. You can sing your way through that. You can smoke cannabis to shake up the pieces on the board. And you can just wait and put up with it. It's the real issue, you see, around fear on psychedelics is a surrender issue. The ego plays a trick on you because the ego begins to dissolve under the influence of the psychedelic, and the ego sends you the message, you are dying. This is its last, most desperate ploy to halt what is happening, because the ego is dying. And to the degree that you identify with the ego, you'll be driven into a state of panic. That joke about the Lone Ranger and Tonto are surrounded by Indians, and the Lone Ranger says, well, it looks like the end of the trail, partner. And Tonto says, it says, it looks like the end of the trail for us, partner. And Tonto says, what mean us, pale face?